There's the right to life, which is the more obvious ones. And the links are obvious, right? If infrastructure is damaged, there could be impacts on life. There could be injury. There could be disease. There could be death. People could die of malnutrition because there is not enough food. Climate migration is this kind of meta idea, right? That people are migrating. Individuals and communities may migrate either voluntarily or they may be forced to migrate because of climate change. In India itself, I think we have several examples. People being forced to leave their homes because of cyclones, floods, droughts. And this is not, and I also want to reiterate that this is not something that's happened in the last 5 or 10 years.
Over the last few months, we have increasingly seen how climate change is causing adverse variations in our weather patterns, be it flash floods or severe heat waves or volcano eruptions. All of these are causing upheavals to human life and livelihood. Climate change-induced adverse weather events pose an existential threat to mankind and threaten our lives, our health, our livelihoods, and our well-being. Yet, we rarely look at climate change as an issue of human rights. Why is this human rights perspective so important in understanding climate change? To talk to me about all of this and more, I am joined by Dr. Lovleen Bhullar, a lawyer and a lecturer at the Birmingham Law School at the University of Birmingham in the UK. Her research areas include a focus on international and domestic environmental law and policy, as well as the enforcement of environmental rights. But before we go any further, a quick reminder. This series is produced as a part of a broader academic collaboration between the National Law University Delhi and the SOAS University of London. The idea is to form a deeper understanding of climate justice and climate law, particularly from the perspectives of the Global South. In this 3-episode podcast series, we speak to leading academics from the UK and India who will help us understand the meaning of climate justice, the impact of colonialism on climate change, the international climate change regime, and why the intersection between climate change and human rights deserves to be spotlighted. Join me, your host Kunal Purohit, in this 3-episode podcast series as I unpack these questions and more. This is the third and the concluding part in a series of 3 episodes.
We're just glad that we finally managed to get hold of you. We were very, very keen to talk to you, and we thought yours would be the perfect way to end the three episode podcast, because I think it's such an important aspect of climate change, and it really has the potential to humanize some of these larger, sometimes abstract, complex concepts that climate change also carries. So which is really why we wanted to end on this note, so that you could really break it down to our listeners. So firstly, Dr. Bhullar, just to begin with and to throw open the conversation a bit, climate change is often looked at as a purely environmental subject, strictly in the realm of the environment and what is happening and what can be done. But I think you bring a very important facet out in the open about climate change, in which is its intersectionality, its connections with human rights. Firstly, tell us how are the two connected, and why is it so important for us to recognize that connection as being a very real and a very urgent connection for us to make?
Yeah, thanks for that question, Kunal. A phenomenon like climate change is, often viewed as a very sort of, natural phenomenon, if you like. And people don't necessarily connect the dots. And part of the reason why we should be connecting the dots is, well, obviously, the fact that it's getting exacerbated because of human activity means that, humanity is very directly involved in, the increased rate at which climate change might be taking place or global warming might be taking place. And it's unfortunate, but it's also, well, in a way, good to know that people are acknowledging that and engaging with that correlationship more. In terms of the link between climate change and human rights, I'll just take a step back and just talk about sort of the impacts of climate change very briefly. Impacts like sea level rise, the fact that there are more, there's a distinction drawn between sudden onset events and slow onset events. And a sudden onset event is an event like an earthquake, a flood, a drought, a storm, a tsunami. And the slow onset events might be more like a temperature increase. Every year the summers might be getting hotter and the winters might get colder. There might be more rain or less rain, etc., etc. Now, these are the impacts of climate change. Now, these impacts of climate change then go on to impact other things, right? So they impact, say, water ecosystems or forest ecosystems, or they might affect infrastructure. The fact that coastal areas may be inundated with water. They may affect water supply, electricity supply, energy supply, etc. They may affect livelihoods. Farmers may not be able to grow their crops in the same way at this, in the same seasons as they did in the past, and other such livelihood impacts. So you can already see where I'm going with this. Now, when we talk about human rights, there's a whole bunch of them, but just to give you some examples, there's the right to life, which is the more obvious ones. And the links are obvious, right? If infrastructure is damaged, there could be impacts on life. There could be injury. There could be disease. There could be death. People could die of malnutrition because there is not enough food. Then we have the right to health. And here I'm thinking about diseases that are linked to food, to water, to sanitation, where infrastructure systems might be affected. If we come to the right to livelihood, the most obvious example is obviously agricultural productivity and how that impacts not just the farmer, but the entire supply chain. The right to food, the right to water, the right to land. And then there are other rights which become really quite important in terms of the link between human rights and climate change. And these are the rights of indigenous peoples in particular. And the two kind of big examples, and one which affects India more directly, is the rights of forest dwelling communities, for example, who would be affected in some ways, or coastal communities. And the other big example that we read about a lot more in newspapers is not necessarily from the South Asian region directly, but we also may be affected in the future, and that's the state of the low-lying island states, right? Like Tuvalu, Kiribati, etc., where the danger is of literally the land beneath your feet being washed away because of sea level rise. So there's a whole basket of human rights which actually is affected and is likely to be affected even more going forward as a result of climate change. So the link is very much obvious, and it's good to know in a sense that people are increasingly talking about that link a lot more now.
So many of our solutions are often towards offsetting our carbon footprints or capping the emissions. Do you believe there needs to be a change in our approach by integrating a human rights perspective to this?
No, absolutely 100%. And I think what you just said really is the big issue, that the approach to climate change is driven so much by mitigation activities. And the thing that I did not say before, which I think is really important, is that not only are climate change impacts likely to affect human rights, but even these solutions to the climate change problem can also affect human rights, right? So if you're talking about mitigation, and if part of the mitigation program is to have more renewable energy projects, in India, we have several examples of what might happen with hydropower projects. Displacement is an issue. So if we actually start connecting the dots between climate change, mitigation as a solution, and hydropower projects as part of the solution, we find solutions to the problem becoming a problem itself. And this acknowledgement is taking place between human rights and climate change, but it's really not enough yet. And I often wonder whether, I'm going to the same church as people like myself who all say, yes, we recognize the problem, but there is so much more that needs to be done, right from the public perception right up to how the governments look at this. And we see this when we see how much of the human rights approach is integrated into government perspectives.
That's a very important point you raised because, we've been here in India reading stories about how the plan to move away from coal is threatening the livelihoods of millions of workers in those mines. And then what next once those coal mines shut down? As you said, sometimes the solution can often, become the problem or exacerbate the problem in different aspects. Do you believe that we've reached a point where we are looking at the solutions also critically with the lens of human rights? Or are we currently just focused on, as you said, a certain approach to climate change, which only looks at solutions and not really the human rights impact of those solutions?
So I think in response to that question, which is another excellent question, is what I would say is we need to think about who this we is. And it's not one we, right? So there is the public perception of climate change and the link with human rights. There is the perception of the link by academics like myself, of activists, of government agencies, of international organizations. And just to reiterate what I said earlier, we have not yet reached that point where we could say that enough of that integration has taken place. And I would also like to add that it's not just about integrating, it's also thinking about that integration more critically, right? Because as we see with the way things play out at multiple levels, it's not just enough to acknowledge the link. It's not enough to say we recognize that people have human rights which could be affected by climate change. What are we going to do about it? And I think that's really the sticky point. And by not acknowledging, by not recognizing, we are almost avoiding, answering those difficult questions.
One of the things that I really wanted to talk to you about, it's also from your presentation, is that we saw some of the terminology around the victims of climate change, if I can call them that. There are the climate refugees, there are the climate migrants, and there are the climate displaced. How are the three separate, and why is it necessary for us to recognize these three as separate categories?
One is climate migration is this kind of meta idea, right? That people are migrating, individuals and communities may migrate either voluntarily or they may be forced to migrate because of climate change, right? Now, this migration is also taking place in different ways at different levels, right? So the migration could be from, say, a village to a city, or among different cities within a country. The migration could also be cross borders, and that migration might be, say, for example, between Bangladesh and India within the same region. Or we're also thinking about migration which might take place at distance. And that's an important thing to understand when we are talking about the terminology. And that's because a lot of the discussion has been around this climate refugee or the climate migrant who is going to, move from the developing world to the developed world and pose a national security concern. And how will our economies deal with, this influx of migrants or refugees, whatever term might be used. And the truth of the matter is, and it's a well-documented fact, that a lot of the migration actually takes place either within a country in the first instance. So this is the idea of the internally displaced. And that might partly answer your question about who this climate displaced person is, yeah? And then when we talk about refugees, climate refugees, now in the media and in sort of popular discussion, the term climate refugee is used. It's quite evocative because, this idea of losing, your home. But in law, it has a very particular meaning. And the meaning for the term comes from an international convention, the Geneva Convention, which deals with, who is a refugee. And it has a very particular understanding of who a refugee is. That's the other interesting and tricky bit about climate change is that these impacts don't operate in isolation. People may not just move or decide to move because of climate change, They might also decide to move because climate change may then affect race relations or relationships based on religion, etc., etc. So that kind of intersectionality between these elements might make a case for why somebody could be covered by the convention. But by and large, because of that very restrictive interpretation of who is a refugee, the term climate refugee might be used popularly, but in law, that kind of protection is still subject to the limitations of the Geneva Convention. So just to say, when we come to the climate displaced, as I said earlier, in law, that is usually discussed in the context of internal displacement. Countries have policies about internal displacement, about resettlement, rehabilitation. All of them don't have those policies, and the ones that do are doing a good job to differing extents, depending on who you speak to. But that's in law, there is a very clear distinction in the sense of under what circumstances a climate refugee would be covered by the refugee law, under what circumstances they would be considered a displaced person.
And, just to give our listeners a sense of things involved here, how common is it now in the world for people to be moving, people to be displaced because of climate change? And if you can give me some examples maybe that people can understand, it can be globally as well, not just within India. But how common is this as a factor? Because we often hear of people, being displaced due to projects, as you said, or people being refugees because of war and conflict. But how common is the idea of a climate refugee, for instance?
Yeah, thanks for making that observation about war and conflict, because one of the examples that you will often see referred to in literature, both academic and otherwise, is the example of Syria. And the fact that, the drought and the conditions in the country kind of exacerbated that situation of conflict, and the link that can be made between that drought and climate change. Now, just to reiterate, and as you were asking me this question, I was thinking that I must add this caveat right away, is the fact that causality is a really big issue, not surprisingly. But what I mean by causality is, how can you show that this displacement has taken place because of climate change only? Now, that's a difficult thing to do. It's a very difficult thing to do because climate change itself is a function of so many different elements. Having said that, what it also means is that many of the events that are taking place in the world right now, which may not on the face of it seem like a climate change emergency, climate change does play a part in it, right? So think about the situation, say, in Bangladesh, where people from rural areas might be migrating to urban areas because they can no longer grow crops. Yeah? It's also true in India, where migration might be taking place or displacement might be taking place. And of course, it's a function of many factors, but climate change does exacerbate that, reality where people are compelled to move from their homes, not voluntarily in this case. Yeah. There are other examples of situations where people might have to move across borders. Examples from, in Central America, where we've had, serious environmental events where we find people trying to cross the border into the US. And, that kind of then leading to that whole sort of fear about national security being undermined by these people fleeing their countries. In India itself, I think we have several examples, people being forced to leave their homes because of cyclones, floods, droughts. And this is not, and I also want to reiterate that this is not something that's happened in the last 5 or 10 years. It's just that the links are being made more clearly, and we are seeing a significant increase in intensity of these events and the displacement that's taking place as a result of them. One can think of so many examples where an environmental disaster, and that's the other bit that's interesting, is how many environmental disasters are also climate disasters then, right? Because in India itself, over the years, we have seen so many events, and they continue to take place. Recently, in neighboring Pakistan, there has been serious flooding in Balochistan, which has caused a great loss of life. And some would argue that there is a connection with climate change there as well. So, I know I'm not giving you maybe very concrete examples, but that's partly because each of these examples to me is an example of climate change induced displacement or migration, which might be the fate of people who are left homeless or landless.
In fact, I think your answer was perfectly on point. But as you said, one of the problems that we currently face is, let's say, taking your example ahead, if crops are successively failing for years and a farmer and his family decide to move, or a farmer and her family decide to move into a city, we often peg it to the process of urbanization. Uh, do we have a data problem because we're not able to capture in granular detail what climate change is really doing to us? Are we sort of slotting them into different silos other than the silo that we should be slotting them into?
I think you've hit the nail on the head, really, because data is a big issue, and the kind of multi-causality issue is part of the problem. In fact, the latest assessment report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change acknowledges the fact that we don't know enough, and that there are serious data gaps. And there are organizations that are to varying extent trying to fill these gaps. We have more information about how many people were displaced. We have more information about how many people were displaced because of certain factors, but it's never just one factor. And I think that interrelations between factors makes it messy, which is not to say that we don't need to address this issue. It's just, it just highlights how complex it is. And just to take your point about, sort of urbanization, I should have said earlier that, I've given you an example from India and from Bangladesh and Pakistan, but then you also have countries like Bhutan and Nepal, our neighbors, who are also seeing serious glacial melt taking place, and that's creating other issues for what are landlocked countries. So there is this element of coastal countries like ourselves and Bangladesh, but then there are other landlocked countries, which is just to say that the impacts are being experienced in different ways because of geography and, of course, socioeconomic profiles of countries, but they're still very serious impacts. And the ability to deal or cope with those impacts is, as you can imagine, within the South Asian region itself, quite imbalanced, really.
You mentioned the IPCC, and I want to take you back to the first IPCC report, which did in some ways predict such a large-scale movement of people due to climate change. My question is now, over 30 years after that report, do we have enough protection for people who've had to move because of climate change? We discussed people displaced or people who are made refugees or rendered refugees because of wars and conflicts. And then you said that there's often a national security lens to climate refugees. My question to you is today, do we have enough protection for climate refugees and the climate displaced? In law, do we have protection enshrined, or is it not? Is it not as popular a cause as often victims of wars and conflicts can be? We've seen that with Ukraine most recently, where so many countries threw open their doors and said we're willing to take people who are displaced because of the war. But do we really see that momentum when it comes to climate change?
Well, firstly, no, we don't have enough protection, right? On a more positive note, things have improved ever so slightly from where we were a few years ago. And I say that for different reasons. The fact that at the international level, we have the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. We call it the UNFCCC, which is kind of the mothership, if you like, of international climate change law. It does not mention this issue at all, right? Now, well, some would argue, back in 1992, 1994, maybe we didn't know enough. Although, the IPCC report that you reference, the first one, which is 1990, is already saying that there is a migration link between climate change and migration. So it's being recognized slowly. And I wonder if part of the reason is that the international framework has been so focused on mitigation, because let's not forget that adaptation, which is the other bit of climate change action, has only recently started, gaining some traction. And even that's has been a big fight, really, to get there. So things are changing ever so slowly. For example, there is the 2018 Global Compact for safe, orderly, and regular migration, and it's not a binding document, but it's saying so much more about migration, about displacement, about the need to do something about these issues. Some would say that the fact that the Paris Agreement, which is the latest iteration of international climate change law, acknowledges the link between human rights and climate change, although in the preamble. And I say although in the preamble because the preamble of instruments is usually seen as a framing document rather than as the part of a document which is leading to some kind of concrete obligations. But it's a big step forward from not having anything about human rights and climate change recognized. Now, does that give protection to people? Automatically, no, it does not. That has to happen in other ways. And this is where, there is a very good article which I would recommend people who are interested in this issue. It's by Carmen Gonzalez, and she writes about, the lens through which climate change, displacement, migration, etc. is looked at. And, one is national security, right? So, if you look at international human rights law, a lot of the rights that I mentioned at the outset are recognized and they're supposed to be protected, right? And the people who are supposed to be protecting those rights are states. Now, in this case, one of the rights which cannot be granted through international human rights law is the right to nationality. That's covered by domestic law. To what extent would countries allow people of other countries to enter? And what rights would they have? How long can they stay in those countries? Do they go back to their countries at some point? What if they can't go back to their country? So I gave the example of low-lying island states. If certain countries are submerged, people can't go back. So domestic laws have to change then to accommodate those individuals and communities. And that's not quite happened, although some changes are being made. Certain countries are introducing point systems to, give certain accommodation to refugees and migrants. To what extent climate change, migrants and refugees could be covered by that arrangement in the future is a watch this space kind of question, really. And the other aspect of this, and I think this is really worth highlighting, is in addition to the national security lens, and this is again Carmen Gonzalez's argument, the other lenses are a humanitarian lens. And this is where, the rights argument is also worthy of consideration in a slightly more critical manner, because the humanitarian lens sometimes has an element of charity. It's saying, let's do something for these poor people who had to be displaced or who've become refugees. But you can't look at it that way. And the reason you can't look at it that way is, let's not forget that there is a huge question of historical responsibility for climate change. One which maybe needs to be put center stage. And it might explain why movement has been slow also. Because it's not just about doing something about this problem. Who should do something? So now if you do a little Google search, you'll find out about all these initiatives that are being taken by the Indian government, the Pakistani government, the Bangladeshi government to move displaced people within the country. The big question is, who should be funding these moves, right? And that's where the question of historical responsibility, the global north and the global south becomes interesting. And that sometimes can provide a lens to explore why international law is or is not the way it is or is not, respectively. Yeah. So that's kind of the other dimension of this. Then we also have a mitigation or migration management approach, right? So disaster management laws. So India has a Disaster Management Act. Other countries have similar laws. We have a Sendai framework at the international level, which is about disaster risk reduction. The argument is that this is not just about national security. It cannot just be about a humanitarian approach. It can't be about migration management. We need to look at this slightly more critically. And the reason we need to do that is also because we might be assuming that people choose or can migrate, right? But as I said earlier, some migrations are voluntary, some are forced. And then you also have what some describe as trapped populations, people who want to migrate but cannot migrate. So law needs to contend with all these different types of migrations that might happen, in addition to the fact that we have that big challenge of causality that you and I discussed earlier.
My last question to you, Dr. Bhullar, is this, and apologies for ending on a bit of a grim note, but what does the future really hold when it comes to climate-induced displacement and climate-induced migration. Do we have a sense of it? Have there been studies done to show how frequent or how common is this going to get? Do we have any sense of how things are going to move going ahead?
Okay, let's do the doom and gloom bit first and then try and think about it a bit more positively, hopefully. So the doom and gloom is, in spite of the fact that there are all the data gaps that you and I talked about, we are getting more and more information. We're getting more and more information partly because sadly, more and more of this is happening, is getting documented, is getting reported, and we are seeing the impact of this play out in front of our eyes on the screen or in the paper. On a slightly more positive note, from not acknowledging this as an issue at all, and I appreciate that acknowledgement is not enough. We need to move so much more beyond that. We are getting to a place, the fact that from making quite a tenuous link between climate change and migration to actually saying that this is a serious issue, to making a stronger link between climate change and human rights, to the fact that more and more action is taking place at the domestic level also. Although for the reason that I mentioned earlier, we still need to remember that there is a global context within which responsibility needs to be discussed. There is movement. The fact that we have, although they are non-binding, and that's an important distinction, the distinction between binding and non-binding instruments, because you can't hold people to account for the things that are said in non-binding things or the promises that are made. The 2018 Global Compact is a good example of some move in that direction. I think you also have to see these developments in a slightly skeptical manner because, they are just the beginning. And I think they do kind of open the path for us to ask more, to demand more. And that can only partly happen through, I think, more awareness, more understanding of the fact that this is not something that's happening somewhere else and will not happen to you, but the fact that it is a global problem. It is still unpredictable, and it could affect you in different ways. So the way it could affect somebody in Bangladesh, or why take the example of another country, how it may affect somebody in Bombay, a coastal city, and somebody in Delhi, a more landlocked area, does not mean that you're not affected by the impacts of climate change. And I think not to create this environment of fear, but I think a healthy appreciation of the scale of the challenge, I think, is really the first important bit. And that's at the more sort of public level. But I think in terms of what academics do, what researchers do, what activists do, and I think everybody is a researcher and an activist in that way, we do need to kind of ask more questions and push for more action, not just domestically, but also from other countries which are historically more responsible, but also have a bigger share of the financial pie.
Absolutely, Dr. Bhullar. A call to action is what we were hoping to end on. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for your time, for your wisdom, for your knowledge. I hope that the listeners gain as much as I have out of this conversation.
Thanks so much, Kunal.
Thank you for listening to this podcast. This was the concluding part of this special 3-part podcast series. We hope you enjoyed it. This is your host, Kunal Purohit, signing off. This podcast was supported by a grant from the British Council.